Muy buenos días tengan todos ustedes. Antes de iniciar, quisiera agradecer la anfitrionía del gobierno del estado de Jalisco por conducto de su secretario de Desarrollo Rural, Héctor Padilla. De igual forma, agradezco la amable invitación que nos hizo el doctor Rafael Gamboa, director de FIRA. Muchas gracias. Y por supuesto aprovechar la oportunidad para felicitar a FIRA, que en este año estará cumpliendo su 60 aniversario de estar sirviendo al campo y de ser un motor importante en el desarrollo de las políticas públicas para este importante sector de la economía y del país. Y por supuesto también felicitarlos por el gran evento que esto representa. Es un evento que el día de ayer comentábamos, es muy oportuno. Sin duda ha logrado reunir a una gama de expertos con un profundo conocimiento y experiencia en la materia, en un momento muy oportuno para nuestro país, donde este tema adquiere especial relevancia. Aprovechando a nuestros panelistas, pues también quiero mencionar que tenemos en este panel, y por lo cual me siento muy honrado de moderarlo, representadas a las 3 organizaciones internacionales más influyentes en materia de diseño de política pública para el sector agrícola y producción de alimentos, como es el Banco Mundial, la OSD y la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para el Campo y la Alimentación. Si me permiten, procedería a presentar a nuestros 3 panelistas. En primer lugar, nos acompaña Carmel Cahill, consejera principal de la Dirección para el Comercio y la Agricultura de la OSD. Es licenciada y maestra en Economía por el University College Cork y maestra en Estadística por el Trinity College de Dublín. Actualmente es consejera principal de la Dirección para el Comercio y la Agricultura de la OSD, donde es responsable de diversas actividades estratégicas de planeación, coordinación y comunicación vinculadas con la alimentación, la agricultura y el comercio internacional. Anteriormente ocupó el cargo de jefe de políticas y comercio de la División de Agricultura dentro de la misma OSD, y es un analista con una gran experiencia en todo tipo de temas de políticas nacionales e internacionales relativas con la alimentación y la agricultura. Antes de estar en la OSD, ocupó varios cargos en los ministerios de Agricultura y Hacienda en Irlanda. De igual forma nos acompaña David Halland. Él es director de la División de Comercio y Mercados de la FAO. David Halland estudió en la Universidad de Oxford y en la Universidad de Reading. Es director de la División de Comercio y Mercados de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para la Alimentación y la Agricultura. Dirige los asuntos de comercio y desarrollo, así como políticas comerciales, agrícolas y alimentarias. Y antes de esto estuvo en la Universidad de Reading, donde se especializó en el análisis de mercados de productos básicos, al mismo tiempo que fue director del Centro para la Estrategia Agrícola de dicha universidad. Ha escrito diversos libros y artículos sobre el mercado agrícola, el comercio y el desarrollo del sector, y asimismo fue editor de la revista Journal of Agricultural Economics. Su trabajo se ha centrado en el análisis de la volatilidad de precios de los alimentos, la integración de los pequeños agricultores en las cadenas de valor y la inversión extranjera directa en el sector en el desarrollo de la agricultura nacional. Y finalmente nos acompaña Will Martin, que funge como gerente de estudios económicos sobre agricultura y desarrollo rural del Banco Mundial. Él es licenciado en Ciencias Agrícolas por la Universidad de Queensland y licenciado en Economía por la Universidad Nacional Australiana. Obtuvo una maestría en Economía Agrícola y doctorado en Economía de la Universidad Estatal de Iowa. Will Martin actualmente funge como gerente de estudios económicos sobre la agricultura y anteriormente fue investigador y director en el Departamento Australiano de Agricultura y Economía. Ha publicado numerosos trabajos sobre política comercial agrícola y con el enfoque particular de la Organización Mundial de Comercio y el Desarrollo Económico. También es actualmente presidente electo de la Asociación Internacional de Economistas Agrícolas. Como pueden ver, tenemos a 3 expertos en el tema específico que nos ocupa el día de hoy. Si me permiten, les explicaría brevemente cuál será la dinámica del panel y a partir de ahí cederle la palabra a nuestros panelistas. Yo me tomaré 5 minutos para exponerles las prioridades del gobierno federal en esta materia. Después les solicitaré a cada uno de los panelistas que tengan una intervención inicial entre 5 y 10 minutos sobre algún tema específico y después se abriría a una ronda de preguntas tanto de un servidor como entre los mismos panelistas y por parte de ustedes, para lo cual les solicitaríamos que las preguntas las hicieran por escrito, se las pasaran a las personas del staff para que nos las hicieran llegar y los panelistas pudieran comentar sobre ellas. Tenemos 50 minutos, entonces me permitiré compartir algunas reflexiones en torno a lo que el gobierno de la República ha planteado respecto de este tema en particular. Desde la campaña electoral, el presidente de la República planteó diversos compromisos con la sociedad mexicana. Uno de ellos, denominado 10 compromisos con tu economía familiar, estableció la necesidad de combatir el incremento y la volatilidad en los precios de los productos básicos. Desde ese momento, esta preocupación se estableció como uno de las prioridades de la agenda del gobierno de la República. Y esto, como ya lo comentó el gobernador del Banco de México, se obedece a la sencilla razón de que la población con menores ingresos gasta prácticamente la mitad de sus ingresos en alimentos. Derivado de esta preocupación, se llevaron a cabo algunos ejercicios y los resultados son verdaderamente preocupantes. Y uno de ellos consistió en tomar la canasta que se utiliza para medir la línea básica de bienestar, a partir de la cual se miden los niveles de pobreza en el país, y se encontró que si los precios de esta canasta no se hubieran incrementado del 2008 al 2012, tendríamos cerca de 10 millones de personas fuera de esta condición. Esta cifra, para ponerla en contexto, contrasta que en los últimos 30 años de una política social agresiva, con transferencias crecientes a las familias, no ha tenido una incidencia significativa en los niveles de pobreza de nuestra población. Es por eso que las políticas o la estrategia diseñada para combatir el alza en los precios y la volatilidad en los mismos se coloca en el centro y en el corazón de la política social de la actual administración, y por eso la razón de ser también de este gran evento. Para atender esta situación, el presidente de la República, el licenciado Enrique Peña Nieto, instruyó la conformación de un grupo intersecretarial en el cual participan directamente los titulares de la Secretaría de Hacienda, de la Secretaría de Economía, la SAGARPA, la Sedesol, y con el apoyo técnico del Banco de México para diseñar esta estrategia. Y en las primeras reuniones, pues lo que se presentó fue el diagnóstico. Ya lo comentó el gobernador del Banco de México y el subsecretario a Portela, y lo que mencionaron es, desde el 2006 hay un cambio estructural en el comportamiento de los precios del sector agropecuario. Básicamente con los tres factores que ya mencionaba el subsecretario: el desarrollo de grandes economías como es la China, como es China y la India, el cambio climático que ha cambiado las condiciones en el campo, y algunos otros como el uso de granos y algunos otros productos agropecuarios para la producción de agrocombustibles. En el caso de México, pues en los últimos años hemos tenido ejemplos paradigmáticos o ejemplos muy ilustrativos. Hace unos días, o bueno, no sé, unos días, en estos días tenemos el caso de limón, donde se vuelve noticia nacional el hecho de que se robaron un camión de limones, donde el precio pasó de 15 pesos a 60 en la mayoría de las ciudades, y en algunos me comentaban que llegaron hasta los 80 pesos. Esto por un caso especial de estacionalidad y seguridad, pero ya también mencionaban el caso del huevo, asociado a asuntos fitosanitarios, y hace algunos años más el asunto del maíz y la tortilla por cuestiones de mercados internacionales. O sea, lo hemos vivido, no solamente en las estadísticas con este cambio estructural, sino de manera muy sensible con productos muy específicos. Derivado de estos grupos se propusieron algunas líneas de acción, entre las cuales se están evaluando la necesidad o la conveniencia de indexar los programas sociales a los precios de los alimentos. Aquí Will Martin ha hecho un trabajo muy importante respecto del impacto de las políticas de combate a los precios sobre el bienestar de las familias, y le solicitaría que en su intervención inicial nos pudiera comentar algo al respecto. De igual forma, en este grupo se está revisando las medidas que pudieran mejorar el programa de coberturas y seguros a través de la agricultura por contratos, y aquí sabemos que David Hallan ha hecho importantes trabajos al respecto, y también le pediríamos que en su oportunidad nos comentara sobre su experiencia en esta parte. Y finalmente también están evaluando acciones de política mucho más amplias que atiendan el problema de manera estructural, y para en el mediano y largo plazo tener un contexto o estructuras más sólidas, en donde se habla de la infraestructura de almacenamiento, la construcción de mercados de físicos y de futuros, la prevención, los sistemas de prevención de desastres, los sistemas de información y políticas transversales como la política de competencia o el antitrust policy. Y sobre eso la OECD ha hecho trabajos muy amplios, donde se ha avanzado mucho, se tienen muchas experiencias a nivel internacional, donde la OECD y Carmel nos podría compartir algunas lecciones, y por lo tanto también le pediría que en su oportunidad nos comentara sobre ello. Si no tuvieran inconveniente, entonces le pediría a Will Martin que nos comentara sobre este primer punto del efecto de las políticas de contención de precios y combate a la volatilidad sobre los niveles de bienestar de la población. Will, si fueras tan amable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's wonderful to be here and to be talking about such an extremely important set of issues. I think the last 7 years have really highlighted the wisdom of the ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Because all of us who worry about food security and care about the ability of agricultural sectors to meet the demands, the needs for food, worldwide, have indeed been living in interesting times. For many years, policymakers had not focused much attention on agriculture, but since 2007, there's been an intense focus. Cabinets focusing on what to do about surging food prices, the G8 focusing on the issue, looking at what to do about raising agricultural productivity, investments in agriculture, the G20 grappling with the issue. A couple of years ago, I had the great pleasure to work with the during the Mexican presidency on a seminar on food security held in Los Cabos. So much focus, so much attention on these issues. But why? Why is it such a curse? Well, as Augustine Carstens reminded us this morning, the poor spend a very large share of their income on food. Most poor people are very vulnerable to increases in the price of food, especially very sharp increases of the type that we've seen in recent years. Very sharp increases that don't give poor farmers the opportunity to adjust to the prices, to increase their output and potentially to benefit from higher prices. So in the initial surge in prices, we estimated, and many studies looked at this issue and reinforced the conclusion that perhaps 100 million people who were previously above the World Bank's extreme poverty line fell below. Their incomes dropped, their real incomes dropped, their cost of living went up, and they fell below the poverty line. That also had serious impacts on their ability to access sufficient, nutritious, high-quality food. The surge in prices in 2010-11 similarly pushed many people into poverty. Although we estimated that it put about 44 million people below the poverty line, although 24 million farmers were made better off by higher prices, and then they were made better off. So about 68 million people total were pushed into poverty, but 24 million people, small farmers, were able to lift themselves out of poverty. But still, an overall seriously adverse impact. Now, in this sort of situation, it's very important that we understand what it is, what caused this such serious problem, the problem of high and volatile prices. And I think there's a lot of analysis that's been done, and we'll talk about during the very well-structured subsequent sessions of this conference. But I think a few things, can really be highlighted. And one is that the growth in yields of the major staple foods, which for many years ran at very high rates, 3, 4, 5% per year. A lot of it driven by the increases in productivity from the Green Revolution, the work of Norman Borlaug and others that got started at CIMMYT in Mexico. But for many years, as I mentioned, policymakers didn't focus on agriculture, the resources weren't invested in research and development, and now we're reaping the harvest of that, slow increases in yields. At the same time, as Mr. Chairman mentioned, we have had continuing strong growth in demand in the many developing economies where diets have diversified and people have been able to move away from just consuming most basic staples. So that continuing growth in demand, especially in countries like China, has made sure that there was strong demand against this slowing increase in yields. Then, of course, somewhat unexpectedly, we had a huge surge in demand for food for use in biofuels, and that pushed down world stocks to relatively low levels and made us very vulnerable to any kind of adverse shock causing the price to rise and prices to remain volatile as they have since 2007. So I think now we have a reasonable understanding of the major driving forces. There was also some extrapolative behavior where countries looked at their stocks, decided to build stocks. Some feel that some private sector agents and speculation was perhaps an issue. But those sort of driving forces are now reasonably well understood. What have we done in terms of policy? Well, I think there are three things that governments can do about high and volatile prices. One, they can use trade measures, export restrictions, lowering import duties to try to hold down the price. Two, they can focus on the consumption needs, how to ensure that the poor are able to access the food that they need. And here Mexico's been a leader in policies in cash transfers designed to help ensure that the poor are able to access food. And the third thing, of course, is to invest in agriculture, to improve productivity, improve varieties, improve transport links, improve efficiency of markets, many of the things that several of the speakers this morning have addressed, because Mexico, again, has been very effective in advancing those policies. Now, at the beginning of the food crisis, many countries reached for the policies that they could use very quickly, and trade policy measures certainly are like that. What countries can do is exporters can put on export restrictions, importers can lower duties. Very many countries did this, perhaps almost a large fraction, especially of developing countries. And why did countries reach for the instruments they could use quickly? Because the crisis was so rapid in its onset. And governments really feel obliged to act when they have poor people and vulnerable people and concerns about access to food. But now we've had time. We have more time to use, to focus on the policies that take more time to adjust, to implement, the cash transfer mechanisms, the investments in R&D. And these policies have the important advantage that they can focus on, they can help to deal with the specific problems at hand, especially the social safety nets. And I think it's really important that we focus going forward on the policies that take time to implement. The social safety net type measures, the productivity measures, and another set of measures that I think we really need to focus on are those that deal with the collective action problems that we face. See, each country can react to a high price by putting on export barriers or lowering its import duties. But these policies help push up the world price. They're, if you like, a beggar thy neighbor response. And in the end, they're not effective in dealing, many of these short-term measures are not effective in dealing with the crisis when we look at them from a broad point of view. So I think the discussion at this very, very important seminar should focus on the long-term measures and the measures that will ultimately be effective in dealing with these vital problems that we face. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and the ideas that will come in the rest of the next 2 days. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will. Then we'll hand the use of the voice to David Hallam to comment on markets and prices. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Osvaldo. And let me begin by thanking our hosts for inviting us here to this event. And it's very good to be back in Mexico. Let me make a few general comments about the subject matter of this seminar, and then to highlight a couple of issues that I think it would be good if we could focus on in the next 2 days. Now, we've seen 3 price spikes on international food markets in the space of 5 years. Now, I think it's important to stress that we're talking about spikes on international food markets, and I think throughout the discussion it's important to distinguish between international price movements and volatility and national price movements and volatility. The two are related, so international price movements are transmitted to a greater or a lesser extent to national prices, but national price volatility and movements also have their own specific driving factors. And so you can find that national price volatility is greater than international or less, depends on transmission, on policy measures, on logistical factors, all kinds of things. But it's important to be clear which we're talking about. The second distinction that I think it's important to be clear on is when we're talking about international price volatility, are we actually talking about high international prices, or are we really talking about volatility? And the two terms tend to get interchanged, but high prices and volatile prices, obviously the volatility tends to come with high levels, but they have their own distinct causes, and depending on which we want to focus on, there are different policy measures that we would want to use. Now, I said that we've seen 3 price spikes in a space of 5 years, beginning with 2007-8, and then again in 2010, and then again in 2012. And so a lot of people were asking the question, is this a new era? You know, we'd had so many years of flat, even declining real prices for agricultural commodities, and then suddenly we had this series of price spikes and heightened volatility. So does this reflect changes which are permanent? Can we expect volatility to continue as a regular feature of markets? And certainly there are a number of new factors at work in markets which you can point to. So, for example, Will has already mentioned the closer links between agricultural markets and energy markets and financial markets. So that's one potential new source of volatilities. But we've also seen, of course, progressive liberalization in international agricultural trade policies. And we've seen some shifts in the geographic structure of production, and notably the growth in importance of the Black Sea region on world markets, which of course is one of the reasons why the current situation in Ukraine gives some grounds for concern. So there are some new factors at work, but what are the impacts of those? Have they really led to a permanent change? Now, of course, the main motivation for looking at high food prices and volatile prices tends to be because of the negative impacts that they have on food security, especially on the poorest in society. Poor families spend a greater proportion of their income on food, and therefore the burden falls heaviest on those. And there are all kinds of estimates about how high prices in 2007-8 led to increasing poverty, greater food insecurity, and so on. I think you have to be very cautious in looking at those kind of issues, because if you look at the surveys that have been done about how households reacted to higher and volatile prices, you find that often what they tried to do was to maintain their calorie intake, and they substituted other forms of expenditure. And unfortunately, some of those forms of expenditure that they reduced were things which led to human capital formation, things like spending on schooling, health, and so on. So the impact of high and volatile prices on consumers is actually quite complicated. It's multidimensional. It's not simply a matter of a reduction in the amount of food that can be afforded. The one group that is often rather overlooked in discussions of food price volatility is producers. And it's very striking, if you look at 2007-8, that we had the highest prices, food prices, for 30 years or something like that. And yet, if you look at how producers reacted to that, if you net out the big commercial trading countries, Brazil, Thailand, and so on, the actual supply response to those very high prices was very limited. So why was that? You know, what were the other factors at work that meant that producers did not react to those incentives? Partly it was input prices rising, partly it was supply-side constraints, partly it was increased risk. So there are reasons there as well, which I think it's interesting to look at. And then the other dimension, which tends to be a little bit overlooked, which I'm very pleased to see is on the agenda for this seminar, is the macroeconomic issues and the relationships between food price inflation and general inflation. The relationships with economic growth, with balance of payments, and so on. These are all important issues to look at. The coming on to policy. Oh, perhaps one final point about the nature of price volatility and what is different. This has been a big international issue. As Will said, it's attracted the attention of the G20, the G8, governments all over the world. It's been very closely linked to political changes as well, and it's often cited as one of the contributing factors in the Arab Spring. But there is a downside to this, and that is that there's been more political and media attention focused on recent food price volatility than has ever been focused on agricultural prices in the past. And sometimes that has worked in a negative way. And there's a lot of evidence now and research work that's been done that has shown how the media, political statements and so on have actually contributed to greater instability in prices. Now, on the policy issues themselves, basically you have a set of choices at national and international levels. You can either try to reduce price volatility using improved market transparency, for example. Some people are talking about using buffer stocks again. So you can try and reduce the volatility, and you can do that at national or international level, or you can simply try to cope with the consequences of it. That is through various kinds of social safety nets, subsidy systems, emergency reserves, and so on. But these are short-term impacts. These are aiming at a short-term fix. There is also the need to consider the longer term, the medium term, and that's all about policies to increase resilience and policies to increase productivity. And you'll remember that under the Mexican presidency of the G20, that was the focus that was chosen. Now, in FAO, we review policy responses on a continuing basis. And I think it's fair to say that in 2007-8, almost all countries in the world reacted in some way by changing their policies to accommodate high prices and volatile prices. Unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, the impact was very limited, or it even made things worse. So the policy decision-making was not the best. And it's interesting to try and think about what worked, what didn't work, how could things be made better. So I think these are some of the issues that we can talk about over these next 2 days. You would think sometimes that there is nothing more that can be said about food price volatility. And yet, there are so many unresolved issues. You know, what is the impact of speculation? How are energy markets and food markets linked? How do prices get transmitted from world markets to national markets? We've got lots of econometrics, but we don't actually know the details of those things. So I'm very pleased to see that so many of these issues are on the agenda, and we look forward to discussing those over the next 2 days. And Osvaldo, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a ti, David. Sin duda es siempre complicado entender a los mercados, pero los de productos agrícolas y agropecuarios son especialmente difíciles, y supongo que ahí hay mucho trabajo que hacer. A continuación le solicitaría a Carmel si nos pudiera apoyar compartiendo algunas de las experiencias internacionales que se han desarrollado a lo largo de los últimos años. Carmel.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's a very great honor to be here and to represent the OECD in this very important conference. I have to admit that we had not expected quite something on this scale with such a large number of people, but it is a great honor and a privilege to be here, and I hope that we will be able to live up to your expectations in terms of providing the knowledge and the information that we have from an international perspective. Now, it's not easy to go third in a panel like this because we didn't really know what kinds of questions we were going to be asked. And my two very good colleagues, Will and David, have already said an awful lot of the important things that need to be said. And in addition to that, because we actually all work together very closely, and the events of the last few years have brought us together even more than in the past. So we have been collaborating very closely. And one result of that, which may be a boring result for you, is that we tend to agree quite closely, maybe not on every detail, but we tend to agree quite strongly on the analysis, both in terms of what we believe are the causes of what we've been seeing in recent years, and also in terms of what we think the solutions should be. But we have a really interesting and in-depth agenda over the next 2 days, and we'll have an opportunity to go into an awful lot of issues in detail and to try to make the experiences that we know about relevant to the very particular circumstances that you're facing. Although I must say, faced with the story about the price hikes on limes, I don't know what to say because I don't know what caused it, and I certainly don't know what the solution is. But maybe somebody can help with that. So, from an international point of view, it's true that at OECD, at the FAO and the World Bank as well, we took our microscopes to the policy responses that countries made to try to understand what worked and what didn't work. I think it would be fair to say there's no one-size-fits-all. Some solutions worked well in some settings. It depended very much on whether countries already had mechanisms in place, whether they already had policy, how would I call it, the administrative capacity to do certain things. It depended on their level of development. It depended on the balance of whether it was poor consumers or poor producers who were being mostly affected, or both, because sometimes your poor consumers are also your poorest producers. So it's very hard to say that this policy worked and the other policy didn't work or never worked. But maybe some general lessons that I could perhaps draw out. A lot of countries reduced their import protection. Now, we would say in general that was a good thing. But in fact, in the circumstances that we've seen in the last few years, reducing tariffs had very small effects, because the price hikes that countries were looking at were just so huge that the tariff reductions in most cases had very little impact. They then created uncertainty because governments were inclined to put them on and take them off, put them on and take them off, and that was not necessarily a good thing. So import measures in general were quite ineffective. Export restrictions, we saw a lot of countries using export restrictions, either vamping up pre-existing export restrictions or actually introducing them. And again, the results were very different in different countries. In some countries, it did actually dampen down the price rises and keep them low during the peaks of the volatility incidents. And in other countries, it didn't work at all. And again, that probably depended to some extent to what kinds of mechanisms those countries had in place prior to the crisis that they were trying to deal with. Countries, some of them began to sell out of stocks. Some of them began to buy stocks on the international market, again with varying degrees of success. A small number of countries decided to stick exclusively to consumer safety net type measures, and so they moved either to distribute foods from existing stocks to the poorest consumers, or they provided top-ups where they had existing social safety nets, cash transfers of different kinds. In general, those kinds of measures were considered to be quite successful for two reasons. They reached the people who were really in need, and they had a much lower fiscal cost than an awful lot of the other measures. Governments, we heard a lot about it this morning, they're interested in inflation control, especially in situations where food prices are really strongly determining the rate of inflation. But as the governor of your central bank said, raising the interest rate isn't going to make the hens lay any more eggs. And I think in general the scope or the success of monetary policy in short-term episodes of price hikes really, it was not successful in any case really. Some other countries went to look at the producer side, especially those that had moved to dampen the price rises for consumers, because when you dampen the price rises for consumers, you also dampen the price rises for producers. And quite a few of them moved to provide input subsidies, fertilizer and energy subsidies, that kind of thing, in order to try to offset the impacts of dampening the prices. Again, sometimes with some degree of success and sometimes with no real success at all. David mentioned it. What we saw in response to those high price episodes in 2007, 8, 9, and even since, is that the really big commercial exporting countries were able to respond to the high price incentives, but we saw very little response from the emerging and developing countries, and that may well have been because of those efforts to dampen down the prices with consumers in mind. I mean, that's the dilemma that governments will always face, that a lower price for the consumer is also a lower price for the producer. So what lessons do we learn? Let me try to draw out 2 or 3 major lessons. One size doesn't fit all, so the appropriate policies will depend on the stage of development. It will depend on how how well organized a government is in terms of implementing certain kinds of policies. But what was surprising and startling and very dramatic during the 8-9 price hikes was the extent of the spillovers. And some of the measures that governments took while they had moderate success in their own economies spilled over and had very severe effects on, for example, poor importing countries and on the poorest consumers, obviously, in those countries. I think analysts concur that it was pretty much hasty and uncoordinated policy responses from governments that caused the very dramatic price hike that we saw in rice in those years. There was no fundamental market issue going on there. It was entirely due to hasty and inappropriate policy responses. So we need to be extremely careful about the impact of the policy measures that we put in place and how they will spill over and then come back to us, in fact. They may come back to you through very strong international effects. A second, I think, general lesson that we need to learn, and both Will and David have said it, is that ultimately the solutions are long-term. And they're in two parts. One concerns poverty, because it is the poorest consumers who are unable to cope with the impacts of high and volatile food prices. It is those families where the children suffer from the nutrition deficiencies that result from trying to cope with high prices, or where pregnant women suffer and all of that kind of thing. So an awful lot of the solution lies in dealing with the poverty issue. It's to do with development and growth and poverty. And as an awful lot of that poverty, we did hear a bit this morning about poverty and food insecurity in cities, but an awful lot of it is in the countryside. And paradoxically, an awful lot of it relates to people who are actually producers of agricultural commodities. So we need to think very broadly in terms of reducing poverty and rural development to find long-term solutions that will allow the poorest families to actually cope with the effect of high prices and volatile prices. And then the second part of that solution, and we come full circle with that, is that we really have to think in terms of a long-term effort to improve the productivity and the resilience of those households, because that will actually help them in a technical sense to be more resistant to the things that are causing the volatility, whether that's weather factors or whatever else it is, but it will also help them to be more resistant in terms of their income status. They will be less poor if we can improve their technical performance and their productivity, and they'll be better able to cope because of that. So I think all of us probably want to come back as we talk over the next few days to that long-term agenda to improve productivity and to reduce poverty. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Carmel, por tu generosa exposición. Hemos recibido varias preguntas por parte de ustedes. Yo me permitiría agruparlas de acuerdo a los temas que abarcan la mayoría de ellas, y sobre eso solicitarles algunos comentarios a nuestros panelistas. En primer lugar, se ha mencionado que en nuestro país es una economía muy abierta, uno de los países con con un número muy importante de tratados comerciales, y eso ha presionado o ha incrementado la importación de algunos productos y por lo tanto desincentivado la producción nacional. Yo le preguntaría a David si en esta parte de los mercados internacionales es conveniente establecer algunas restricciones al comercio para efectos de evitar estos mecanismos de transmisión de la volatilidad de los mercados y quedarnos promoviendo más la producción a nivel local, o en qué medida se podrían coordinar las políticas comerciales entre países para mitigar en alguna medida la volatilidad de los precios. Nos quedaremos con esa y después de tu respuesta haríamos algunas otras a Carmel y a Will, si estás de acuerdo.
That's a good and tricky question to begin with, but let me try to say a few things about it. It was certainly the case that in 2007-8, as Carmel explained, there was a lot of use of trade policy to try and respond to high prices. So what you saw was that tariffs typically were reduced, and in the case of exporters, you had export restrictions being imposed. Now, those were in some ways a variation on the general trends that we've been seeing in trade policy through time. And so, we've seen a gradual liberalization of international agricultural trade, which has brought with it the argument that opening markets exposes your domestic production sector to competition from exports from other countries, which may be lower cost producers and so on. So in the short term, there can be losers from trade liberalization, and that's why the WTO has spent a lot of time and argument over the last few years in trying to bring in various protective devices, as under the Marrakesh decision. So the mechanisms like special safeguards, the special products, and so on, where they're trying to allow countries a certain amount of, if you like, slack in determining their trade policies. What we also now, those mechanisms are imperfect in many ways and still under development, but it is an issue, and the impact of what is sometimes called kind of excessive imports or import surges that can have a damaging effect in the short term. In the longer term, of course, opening your markets to trade should lead to a stronger situation with higher productivity and so on. One other element that and in a way what this question implies, another element of what we saw as a response to 2007, 2008 was this re-emergence of interest in food self-sufficiency. And again, partly this was because international markets were seen as not entirely reliable sources of food supplies after different countries imposed export restrictions and so on. And so there was a re-emergence of interest in promoting food self-sufficiency. I think there are limits to that, and it's important that we bear in mind that there is an argument for improving resilience, for improving productivity, but that's a rather subtly different argument from the one that favors autarky. So I'll stop.
Muchas gracias, David. Una pregunta también recurrente por parte de ustedes tiene que ver con la política de subsidios, apoyos y estímulos a los productores. En este caso, le preguntaríamos a Will Martin respecto de cuál sería una estrategia adecuada por parte de los gobiernos nacionales respecto de los subsidios a los productores o los subsidios a los consumidores, a la gente. ¿Cómo podríamos estructurar una política congruente de subsidios atendiendo a ambos lados de la ecuación.
Thank you. Wonderful question. I'd just like to pick up on the point that David raised, the point about self-sufficiency, or that David addressed rather. The idea of achieving self-sufficiency seems appealing. The world market is volatile. If countries can isolate themselves, they'd be less volatile. The logic seems to be there, but in fact, it isn't. A completely isolated market will be very volatile. You have much more volatile yields in an individual country than for the world. So I think it's very, very important when thinking about policies to support agriculture to avoid thinking, well, self-sufficiency would be better. One wants to think about how to use the international market. Countries have options for using price-based measures that can reduce volatility rather than increase it. Now, in terms of the support to agriculture, the very specific question, what I think is really important to remember is governments have limited resources to support agriculture. If they put those resources into research and development, it seems that for every peso you invest in research and development, the evidence is that you get back something like 10 pesos. If you support agriculture by a subsidy or a protection, a tariff on imports, the money that goes to agriculture is small as a share of the total revenue spent, the money spent, or the transfer from consumers. And this is work that Kamal knows a great deal about, monitors all the time. So it's much better to invest those limited resources in ways like research and development that will have much bigger yields, that will increase output, that will help to deal with the high prices that we face, than it is to put them into production subsidies, which don't have that long-term benefit that you get from research and development. Another important place to invest scarce resources is in social safety nets, in cash transfers that can help the poor deal, the people who really need support, to help them deal with problems when prices spike.
Muchas gracias, Will. Otro tema recurrente en sus preguntas tiene que ver con la estructura de los mercados y la falta de competencia, tanto en la parte de los insumos como en la parte de la comercialización. Es decir, que estructuras poco competitivas en estas dos etapas de la producción o generan especulación por el lado de la comercialización o una inflación en los insumos que inciden sobre este fenómeno. Al respecto, le preguntaría a Carmel si hubiera algunas experiencias respecto de cómo se ha podido combatir o mejorar el funcionamiento de los mercados de insumos y de comercialización en términos de incrementar la competencia y el número de participantes y combatir la especulación. ¿Qué experiencias existirían al respecto y que nos pudieras compartir?
Thank you. This is a really important issue, especially in emerging and developing countries, although the OECD countries are not immune from problems in that respect either. But what we very often observe is governments putting measures in place, for example, protective measures at the border in order to raise prices, putting input subsidies in place, for example, to reduce the price of energy or to reduce the price of fertilizers. When you look at the situation at the farm, you see that none of it gets to the farm. So your consumers in urban areas are paying higher prices as a result of these measures. And very often your input suppliers are capturing the benefits of the measures that the government has put in place in order to try to reduce the input costs to the farmers. And this indeed very often is to do with sort of general problems in market functioning, which may be to do with highly concentrated upstream and downstream sectors, but it can also be to do with very poor, what I would call market infrastructure. And that might be market infrastructure in the regulatory sense, or it may be market infrastructure in the physical sense. So there are lots of solutions, and maybe I'm a little bit out of my depth here, and Will and David might have more to say about it. But I mean, clearly, investing in the infrastructure, the roads, the storage, and all of those things that give the farmers and those closest to the farm gate a bit more choice about the actions that they take will also give them a little bit of countervailing power when the downstream sectors are highly concentrated. So that is certainly one thing that can be done. In addition to which, of course, I mean, countries really need to look at those issues of concentration. But it's very, very clear that when you attempt to intervene in order to raise prices or raise incomes at the farm level, and you have these problems of market structure, very often the transmission of that assistance to the farm sector will be very, very poor. There are also, of course, all sorts of things that can be done at a local level to enable farmers to come together, to form groupings, to market their products and that kind of thing. Very much local level interventions to improve the kinds of institutions which can be helpful as well. But perhaps, if I may, Will or David might want to add something in this area.
Thank you very much. Tenemos algunas preguntas muy puntuales sobre las cuales nos gustaría alguna reflexión de los panelistas, que se han comentado como políticas o propuestas muy específicas. Una de ellas es la posibilidad de incorporar, construir reservas estratégicas sobre determinados productos que permitan atender o mitigar la volatilidad. Es una práctica común, es deseable. ¿Alguna experiencia al respecto? Les pediría a David si pudiera comentar algo breve sobre esto.
Thank you, Osvaldo. Yeah, there's been a revival of interest in recent years in the extent to which stocks, reserves can be used in relation to food price spikes. And interestingly enough, in January this year, in FAO, we held an expert meeting on this very subject. How can reserves be used and so on. There's certainly a broad relationship between price volatility and stock levels. That's for sure. It's not so easy to measure that precisely, and it's even less easy to use that relationship to actively manage price volatility, to vary stocks. Nevertheless, there is a lot of interest. I think that the balance of evidence suggests that the attempts that have been made to manage price volatility through stock variations have in general not worked very well at all. Maintaining stocks is a high-cost exercise. It involves some very complex decision-making in terms of when you buy, when you sell, what your price targets should be. There's risk of political interference. And so all of the examples that we've looked at suggest that it's a problematic approach. Now, that is not to say, though, that reserves don't have an important role as an emergency, as part of an emergency response to bridge short-run reductions in availability. So, but I think that's a different thing. So, in general, I guess the view is small-scale emergency reserves good, larger-scale market management kind of reserves not so good at all.
Muchas gracias. Carmel, do you want to comment on this, please?
If I could just add one point, David has mentioned the history of trying to use stocks to manage price fluctuations in the past. When that was done in the past, it was almost always in a situation where the problem was low prices and the intention was to raise prices to some minimum with a view to assisting producers. And with the very low rate of success and very high costs that we have seen in over time, the situation in recent years and the situation that's likely to persist for the next few years is rather one of volatility around high prices. And that's probably an even more difficult situation. And you're likely to incur even more costs and with less success, because generally the market will know how much stocks you have, and when you've got rid of them, the market knows that you don't have any more. And using stocks in order to dampen high prices is, I think, probably even a harder thing to do than buying stocks in order to keep prices up in certain circumstances. So we're looking at, I mean, we think past experience is important in this, but that using buffer stocks to dampen price fluctuations is probably even harder in the current environment than it would have been in the past.
Muchas gracias, Carmen. Otra pregunta, ya estamos agotando nuestro tiempo. Se refiere a los temas de productividad. Will mencionaba que es uno de los factores que han incidido sobre este nuevo fenómeno o este cambio estructural, y en particular mencionan el potencial del uso de los transgénicos, que es un debate presente en México y en todo el mundo, sobre qué tan importante podría ser el uso de esta tecnología para efectos de incrementar la productividad y mitigar la volatilidad. Si nos pudieras comentar, Will.
A wonderfully controversial issue. I think in general it's very, very clear that raising productivity is absolutely essential. We're going to have continuing strong demand for food over the next 40 years, 50 years, population still growing. Fortunately, many people are moving from very, very poor diets to diets that are more diversified, that include animal products as well as basic staples. So those increases in demand. We don't have much more land, and we certainly don't have much more water to bring into play, except in a few areas in parts of Latin America and in Africa. So productivity has to be the absolute key. We really want to look at the whatever approaches we can to securing productivity gains. I think it's really important that in deciding on which types of productivity gain we want to use, we really look at evidence, we look at science-based approaches as to what the implications, what the dangers, the upsides and downsides of those forms of technology are. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Y para cerrar el panel, les pediría a cada uno de nuestros panelistas una última reflexión en torno a si la seguridad alimentaria debe ser una política de Estado y de seguridad nacional. ¿Cómo rankear las políticas orientadas a la seguridad alimentaria dentro de la agenda de políticas públicas de los gobiernos nacionales? El orden sería Carmel, Will y David para cerrar.
That's a very big question. Of course, every sovereign government and we heard it this morning, has it very much amongst its top priorities to ensure the food security of its people. It's such a basic, such a fundamental. And of course, policies to achieve that then also have to be extremely high on the list of priorities. But the question is, can we agree about how? And I mean, we see from the questions, we see from the conversation here already this morning that there's quite a lot of difference of opinion as to the how. But governments all around the world are facing difficult choices about the kinds of ways that they spend limited resources. And it's incumbent on them to find the ways that are most efficient, most effective, and most equitable. And for me, probably the one to hold on to is the question about equity and fairness in the policy measures for food security. Because an awful lot of the measures that we take, for example, on the farm side, have very regressive impacts. So most efficient, most effective, and most equitable. And for me, probably the one to hold on to is the question about equity and fairness in the policy measures for food security. Because an awful lot of the measures that we take, for example, on the farm side, have very regressive impacts. So you intervene in order to increase